The gavel slammed down with a sharp crack, echoing through the packed courtroom like a thunderclap. All eyes turned to the judge, a stern-faced man with a reputation for being unyielding, his voice dripping with authority as he addressed the two young defendants standing before him. "You think the law doesn't apply to you?" he sneered, his tone laced with disdain. "Well, today you'll learn otherwise." The twins, barely 18, stood side by side, their faces a mix of defiance and fear. They were identical in every way. Same dark skin, same piercing eyes, same quiet strength that seemed to radiate from them despite the weight of the moment. But what the judge didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was who their father was. And that single piece of information was about to turn everything upside down. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The twins, Malik and Jamal, had been caught up in a situation that was far bigger than they'd ever imagined. It started with a misunderstanding, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, here they were, standing in front of a judge who seemed determined to make an example out of them. His words were harsh, his tone cutting, as he lectured them about responsibility and consequences. "You think you're special?" he barked, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. "You think the rules don't apply to you because of who you are? Well, let me tell you something. No one is above the law." The twins exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. They knew something the judge didn't, something that would change everything. The story of Malik and Jamal wasn't just about a courtroom drama. It was about identity, about family, and about the lengths a father would go to protect his children. Their father wasn't just any man. He was a figure of immense power and influence, a man whose name carried weight in ways most people couldn't even begin to understand. But he was also a man who had spent years keeping his family out of the spotlight, shielding them from the dangers that came with his position. And now, as his son stood in that courtroom, humiliated and vulnerable, he was faced with a choice. Would he step in and reveal the truth? Or would he let the system run its course, risking everything he'd worked so hard to protect? As the judge continued his tirade, Malik clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wanted to speak up, to tell this man exactly who they were and why he had no right to talk to them like that. But Jamal, ever the calm and collected one, gave a subtle shake of his head. "Not yet," his eyes seemed to say, "not here." The tension in the room was palpable, the silence broken only by the judge's voice as he handed down his ruling. "I'm sentencing you to 30 days in juvenile detention," he declared, his tone final. "Maybe that will teach you some respect for the law." The twins' hearts sank, but before the bailiff could step forward to escort them out, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. All heads turned as the doors swung open, and a figure strode in with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. The man was tall, his presence filling the room as he made his way down the aisle. His eyes locked onto the judge, and for the first time, the stern-faced man behind the bench seemed unsure of himself. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe there's been a mistake." The judge frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to place the familiar face. "And who might you be?" he asked, his tone less confident now. The man smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "I'm their father," he said simply. And with those 3 words, the entire dynamic of the courtroom shifted. But before the judge could respond, before anyone could fully process what was happening, the man dropped a bombshell that left everyone stunned. "And I think you'll find," he continued, his voice steady, "that this case isn't as straightforward as it seems." The room erupted into murmurs, the tension reaching a boiling point as the twins' father stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the judge. What happened next would change everything, not just for Malik and Jamal, but for everyone in that courtroom. The judge, once so confident and unyielding, now looked uncertain, his authority slipping as the truth began to unravel. But what was that truth? And how far would their father go to protect his sons? The answers to those questions would come, In time. But for now, the room was left in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. As the twins stood there, their father by their side, they couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But it was short-lived, because they knew this was only the beginning. The judge's humiliation was just the first step in a much larger game, one that would test their family's strength, their loyalty, and their very identity. And as the courtroom doors closed behind them, the twins couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just about to begin. What would happen next? Would their father's intervention be enough to clear their names, or would the judge's pride push him to retaliate, setting off a chain of events that no one could control? The answers were still out of reach, hidden in the shadows of a story that was far from over. And as the screen fades to black, one thing is certain: this is a tale you won't want to miss. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the twins' father stood tall, his presence like a storm cloud gathering over the proceedings. The judge, visibly flustered, leaned back in his chair, his gavel forgotten on the desk. "Mr. he began, his voice trailing off as he searched for a name. The man didn't wait for an invitation to speak. "Marcus Carter," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. The name landed like a boulder in a quiet pond. Marcus Carter. It wasn't just a name, it was a legacy, a reputation, a story that most people in the city knew by heart. But the judge, new to the district and unfamiliar with the local power dynamics, seemed oblivious. "Mr. Carter," he said, trying to regain control, "this is highly irregular. Your sons have been found in violation of—" "With all due respect, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "There's been a misunderstanding. My boys weren't involved in what you think they were. And before this goes any further, I think it's important to set the record straight." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Malik and Jamal exchanged another glance, their expressions a mix of relief and apprehension. They knew their father didn't step into the spotlight lightly. If he was here, it meant things were serious, very serious. To understand why Marcus Carter's presence sent shockwaves through the courtroom, you'd have to go back years, decades even. Marcus wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a pillar of the community, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. Born and raised in the same neighborhood his sons now called home, Marcus had seen the struggles of his people firsthand. He'd fought his way out of poverty, not just for himself, but for his family and his community. Along the way, he'd earned respect, loyalty, and in some corners, fear. He was a man who got things done, whether through legal means or otherwise. But above all, he was a father who loved his children fiercely and would do anything to protect them. The twins, Malik and Jamal, had grown up in the shadow of their father's legacy. They'd heard the stories, seen the way people looked at him when he walked into a room. But Marcus had always been careful to shield them from the darker side of his world. He wanted them to have a normal childhood, to make their own choices, without the weight of his name hanging over them. And for the most part, they had. They were good kids, smart, respectful, and hardworking. But they were also teenagers. And like all teenagers, they sometimes found themselves in situations they couldn't fully control. The incident that landed them in court had started innocently enough. A friend's party, a late night, and a decision to take a shortcut through a part of town they probably shouldn't have been in. When the police showed up, responding to a report of a break-in at a nearby store, the twins had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They hadn't done anything wrong, but the officers, seeing two young black men in a neighborhood they didn't belong in, had assumed the worst. The twins had tried to explain, but their words fell on deaf ears. And now here they were, standing in front of a judge who seemed determined to make an example out of them. Marcus had been out of town when he got the call. He'd been in the middle of a high-stakes business meeting. But the moment he heard what had happened, he dropped everything and rushed back. He knew how the system worked, how it could chew up kids like his and spit them out without a second thought. And he wasn't about to let that happen. Not to his sons, not to his family. As Marcus stood in the courtroom, his mind raced. He knew he had to tread carefully. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and this could spiral out of control. But he also knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when his boys' futures were on the line. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I understand the seriousness of the situation, but I also know my sons. They're good kids. They've never been in trouble before, and they certainly weren't involved in any criminal activity that night. If you'll allow me, I'd like to present some evidence that will clear their names." The judge hesitated, clearly thrown off by Marcus's confidence. He glanced at the prosecutor, who shrugged, equally unsure of how to proceed. "Very well," the judge said finally, though his tone suggested he wasn't happy about it. "But make it quick, Mr. Carter. This court has a schedule to keep." Marcus nodded and pulled out his phone, tapping a few times before handing it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. On the screen was a video, security footage from a nearby gas station. It showed the twins walking down the street, clearly minding their own business at the exact time the break-in had occurred. The timestamp was impossible to argue with. The judge's face tightened as he watched, his earlier confidence wavering. "This changes things," he admitted reluctantly. But before he could say more, Marcus spoke up again. "There's more, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've also spoken to the store owner, who confirmed that the suspects were two older men, not my sons. The police report was mistaken." The room erupted into murmurs again, the tension thickening. The judge looked from Marcus to the twins, then back to the video on the screen. It was clear he was struggling to maintain control of the situation. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "But if what you're saying is true, then it seems there's been a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. For the twins, it was a small victory, but they knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The judge might have been forced to acknowledge the truth, but his pride had taken a hit, and pride was a dangerous thing in a man with power. Marcus knew it too. He could see it in the judge's eyes, the flicker of resentment, the barely concealed anger. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As the judge dismissed the case, his tone clipped and his face red, Marcus put a hand on each of his sons' shoulders and guided them out of the courtroom. The crowd parted as they walked, whispers following them like a trail. Outside, the sunlight felt harsh after the dim lighting of the courtroom, and the twins blinked as their eyes adjusted. "Dad," Malik began, his voice shaky. "We didn't—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "I know you didn't. But this isn't over. That judge, he's not going to let this go. Not easily." The twins exchanged a worried glance. They'd seen the look in the judge's eyes, too. "What do we do?" Jamal asked, his voice quieter than usual. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "We stay smart," he said finally. "We stay careful. And we stick together. No matter what." But even as he said the words, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The judge's humiliation was just the spark. The real fire was still waiting to ignite. And when it did, Marcus knew it would test everything. His family, his reputation, and the very foundation of the life he'd built. As they walked to the car, the twins silent beside him, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the next move would be. And more importantly, who would make it. The screen fades to black once more, the tension unresolved, the story far from over. What happens next? The answers are still out of reach, hidden in the shadows of a conflict that's only just begun.